Good morning. How are you all this Easter week leading up to Easter? We celebrate the Passover that Jesus became our Passover lamb every year about this time. So bless you all in your celebrations for that precious and valuable time when Jesus paid our sin debt through his death, burial, and resurrection. We're continuing to study from the book of Esther, and today we're in chapter 2. We're looking at the providence of God for his people. And in chapter 2, we're going to see God's handiwork in raising of Esther to become queen of the Persian Empire. So thank you all for listening and welcome to Bible class with us. Okay, it says in Esther chapter 2 verse 1, after these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. Now, sometime after the events of chapter 1, the king was no longer dwelling on his anger toward Vashti. And he had made this decree that through his administrators, that women would have to submit to their husbands, because if they heard what Vashti did, then they would disrespect and not honor their husbands. So when the king's anger was no longer present, he remembered Vashti and what she had done. Verse 2 says, then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king. Let there be young women who are virgins be searched through all your provinces for to replace Vashti. Verse 3, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom. Remember, there were 127 provinces that Ahasuerus ruled over. And that the word God or any of his compound or primary names are not used in the book of Esther, nor the word pray or prayer. But these officers asked the king to appoint officers all over his provinces of his kingdom. And the reason is that they may gather together all the fair young virgins unto Shushan the palace, to the house of the women, unto the custody of Hegi, the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let their things for purification be given them. So these officers was to go throughout these states or provinces and find all of the beautiful young women and bring them to this designated place called the House of Women. And this man, Hegi, had been prepared by the king to be the keeper of women, which means that he was more probably a eunuch who had been castrated, because the men that kept the women were so done that they would not themselves be involved with the young women. Verse 4. And let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti. So he's getting this advice from the men of his administration. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. So he appointed these officers. Now, verse 5 is a parenthetical verse that explains the events to introduce Mordecai, who is very prominent in this story. Verse 5 says, Now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. And we know King Saul was a Benjamite who was the king, the first king chosen to rule over the people of Israel. But Mordecai is identified as a Jew descending from the tribe of Benjamin. And we know the son Benjamin means son of my right hand. Verse 6 says, Who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. This was the second deportation of which the people of Judah had been carried into Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar and his son and his grandson had run the Babylonian kingdom, and they were no longer in power. And the second world empire, Media-Persia, was now in power. So this Mordecai was taken captive during the time of the second deportation. And verse 7 says, And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So this means that Mordecai raised Esther, and her name being Hadassah means myrtle, and explaining that means Esther, and the name Esther means star. So he raised his first cousin as if she were his own daughter. So that means he took really good care of Esther. Verse 8. So it came to pass when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered, maidens would also mean young virgins, was gathered together unto Shushan the palace to the custody of Hegai, that Esther was brought also unto the king's house, to the custody of Hegai, keeper of the women. And so they are young women, and this man, Hegai, is keeping them, and they are under his leadership. Verse 9. And the maiden pleased him, and the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him. Oh, I'm sorry, I need to go back to verse 8. And it came to pass when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together unto Shushan the palace, to the custody of Hegai, that Esther was brought also unto the king's house, to the custody of Haggai, keeper of the women. And the maiden, talking about Esther, pleased him, and she obtained favor of him. And he speedily gave her her things for purification, with such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens which were fitting or meet to be given her out of the king's house. And he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of women. So he saw Esther, and he preferred her, she obtained favor and kindness of him, and so he assigned her unto the best place in the king's palace that was set up to place the women there. And so Esther was very lovely and a beautiful young woman to go before this man. And then verse 10 says, Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred. The reason is for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. So in some way between verse 5 and this time, Mordecai I keep saying Mordecai, but it's Mordecai, had contact with Esther, and in the meantime, he instructed her not to tell anybody that she was a Jew. And Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did and what should become of her. Because she was like a daughter unto her, he wanted to make sure she was protected and that he would know if anything other than good care was being taken for Esther. Verse 12, now when every maid's turn was come to go in to King Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months according to the manner of the women, for so were the days of their purifications accomplished, to wit, or to be exact, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet odors, and with other things for the purifying of the women. So the woman had to be a whole year under this ritual of purification before she was allowed to go in unto the king. And I'm sure this was for some medicinal reason, to make sure she was not infected with some kind of disease. Verse 13. Then thus came, that is after 12 months, then thus came every maiden unto the king. Whatsoever she desired was given her to go with her out of the house of women unto the king's house. So she received special attention when it was time to go in to see the king. And so verse 14 says, in the evening she went, and on the morrow of the next day she returned unto the second house of the women, to the custody of another man named Shaashgaz, the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines. So this means that the king had a sexual relationship with her, and she was no longer a virgin. She is now labeled to be a concubine. And so it says, and she came in unto the king no more, once she had been there that night, and returned The next day she saw the king's face no more, except the king delighted in her, and that she was called by her name. So this was a requirement. She came in and left the next day to go back to another house called the house for the concubines. And if the king never called her again and called her by name, she could not go back. Verse 15. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come to go in unto the king, she required nothing. She didn't make any suggestions. But what Haggai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed, whatever he appointed, that's all she asked for. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. So she had gone through like a pageant to show her beauty, but everybody that saw her was very pleased with her. Verse 16. So Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus into his house royal, or royal house, in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. So this is 4 years later, after he had had all of these celebrations with his officers and then with the staff. Verse 17. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace. See, she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So she is not a concubine. He married her and made her Queen Esther instead of Vashti. Verse 18. Then the king made a great feast unto all his princes and his servants, even Esther's feast. So this king loved to celebrate by throwing huge parties. And he made a release to the provinces and gave gifts according to the state of the king. Now this release to the provinces is going to show in the next few verses that the virgins that had been gathered together were now called back, and they were released from the house of the concubines and went back to wherever they came from. So this release is for the virgins some had become concubines, but he allowed them to go back home and also gave them gifts according to the riches and wealth of the king. Verse 19. And when the virgins were gathered together the second time, that's the release, then Mordecai sat in the king's gate. So Mordecai was a gatekeeper during this time. And verse 20 says, Esther had not yet showed her kindred nor her people, as Mordecai had charged her. She obeyed the commands of Mordecai, her uncle, who had raised her as his daughter. For Esther did the commandment of Mordecai, like as when she was brought up with him. Verse 21. In those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlain, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door were wroth or angry, and sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. So they were upset with the king, and these two men planned to kill the king. And verse 22 says, and the thing was known to Mordecai. Mordecai knew what their plans were. And Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen. So when Mordecai heard of what they were going to do, he took it upon himself to tell Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name, not in her own name. She did not take credit for what her uncle had done, for what her first cousin, had done. Verse 23, and when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out. Therefore, they were both hanged on a tree. These two men, Bigthan and Teresh, when what they had done, when that had been investigated and found to be true, then they were both hanged on a tree. And at the same time, it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. Now, the Chronicles are the historical records of the government of Media and Persia. And this incident is going to come up again in chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. And we're going to see how what Esther did in letting the king know what these men had planned was recorded by God in the record, the historical records, because this other incidents were going to come up. And this that Mordecai had done is going to become relevant to how the rest of the story in the book of Esther will go. So we have concluded. It didn't take as long as I thought it would to do these verses, but we're going to stop at this chapter, and next week we're going to look at this conspiracy that this man called Haman would come up with, simply because Mordecai would not bow down to him and honor him as being a great man. And we'll see throughout life that when people demand you to treat them as though they were God, and when you don't, they'll start plotting against you to bring you down. So thank you all for listening. And again, I'm wearing the mask because I'm having dental work done. And please, when you look at the videos, please like, share, and subscribe if you have not already subscribed. And if you are on Facebook, I love to hear your comments and questions. So thank you all for listening, and be sure to view my other videos. It's several of them now. I'm not going to name them today, but if you type in Betty Thomas, you'll see the videos will come up, and there are several. So thank you all, and you all enjoyed Easter celebration. And remember, Jesus has already paid our sin debt. This is just a time to remember and celebrate what he has done for us in his death, burial, and resurrection. So have a great day and a great week. Bye.